HLA community to share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience. Many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have. HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur, the leader is a communicator, the leader is a manager, the leader as a negotiator, the leader as a follower, and the leader as a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty. Tonight's episode of HLA Live is hosted by Geith Silva, one of our excellent HLA scholars. Geith has a fabulous panel discussing South Asian influences on the NHS. I hope you enjoy it.
My name is Geith Silva and I'm an academic foundation doctor working currently in Leicester. I have a strong passion for surgery, medical technology and encouraging civility within the workforce. Having been born in Sri Lanka, growing up in the UK and also training in the UK, I know the importance of role models, diverse leadership and discussing these topics in depth. Therefore, I'm glad to be joined by an expert panel to talk about these issues, and I'll introduce them shortly.
We have Julian Simpson, who's an independent writer, researcher and translator and author of Migrant Architectures of the NHS. And he has been published widely on the history of migration, the history of the NHS and the relevance of history and policy in general, including the BMJ, the British Journal of General Practice and the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine and Contemporary British History. He is also co-editor of History, Historians and Immigration Debates. We also have Professor Rajan Menon, a consultant ophthalmic surgeon, and besides partaking in high-volume cataract surgery, she also serves as a clinical director for Kent, Surrey and Sussex Clinical Research Network, where she looks after research in all specialities in the region. In 2016, she was awarded the Royal College of Physicians and NIHR Award for Outstanding Research Leadership in the NHS. In 2018, she was appointed Postgraduate Dean for South London, definitely a role model to aspire to. Ratnu Vidya is a medical student at Newcastle University and a current HLA scholar and president of Newcastle Psychiatric Society with a keen interest in psychiatry. He's interested in intellectual disability psychiatry and how we can improve healthcare systems. Joining us is also Dr. Neil Singh, who's a British Indian primary care physician and senior teaching fellow in the Department of Primary Care and Public Health at Brighton Sussex Medical School. He's also a writer and his work on health has featured in The Guardian, The Independent and The New Statesman and Open Democracy. Clearly a good knack for writing there. Also, we have Rajan Menon. He's originally from India. Rajan, he came to the UK in 1980 and after training worked as Director of Public Health and Medical Director for various organizations until his retirement. So with that, we have quite a breadth of different people from different backgrounds, but all have a very important message to say regarding this topic. So the first presentation that we have is Neil talking about his recent work. So Neil, over to you.
My name's Neil Singh. I'm a GP. I'm based in Brighton, and apologies for the technical issues there. Yeah, so I'm a teaching fellow at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and I'm going to talk about something which is very familiar to all the people on the panel with me, but when I give this talk to the doctors, medical students, it's often the first time that they've really thought about this kind of topic. So hopefully it will trigger some debate. This article that I wrote last year came out in The Independent. Really what I was trying to do here, and when I talked about an empire at home, I wanted to bring this idea of empire into our analysis of the NHS. Because when we think about the NHS, and we are rightly proud of its diversity, we think about how many people there are from so-called BAME backgrounds working in the NHS. And on the one hand, we should be proud of that. But what I ask in this article is, is that the whole story? Why is it that so many of these people originate from former colonies? And is it a sign that perhaps, rather than thinking, oh, well, the age of empire is over and now we have a fully inclusive society, perhaps the precise opposite is true? And so the way I wanted to answer that is to draw on my own history, because I have 3 generations, the third generation of people, of Indian male doctors working with and alongside the British. And the first was my grandfather. And this is a photograph of him on the left there. So to begin, obviously there have been more ancient medical traditions in India, but in terms of modern medicine, the effect of empire on the health and the health system in India was not positive. I think that's the first thing to make clear, that Britain actually shut down all existing indigenous medical training in India and set up medical schools to serve the colonies and essentially white colonialists in those colonies. And so what was the role of Indians as doctors in this system? Well, to begin with, they just didn't exist. They were completely banned from entering this profession for various reasons. But later, as there were staffing shortages, we see Indians working first as assistants and then working as doctors, but always having lower status than their white counterparts in the colonies. And it was under British rule that my grandfather was born in the 1920s. He went to Patna Medical School in Bihar, again, before independence. And then after independence, as the British left, his generation went on to fill the top posts. He became a professor of surgery himself. And, so on the one hand, that's a very proud story, but, the generation that followed, and some of the other panelists will say more about this, I'm sure, decided not to remain in India for various pull and push factors, and instead to move and train and work in the West. And so we have to link this to a broader movement of migration in this transition period from empire to Commonwealth. So it's no coincidence that within a year, India as a colony became independent and the NHS was born. And, I hope I'm not going too far to link those two moments in history. We see the British Nationality Act granting the Commonwealth immigrants from all of the former Commonwealth rights at this time to work and gain access to public services in Britain. And lots of people spoke with utopian zeal about what the Commonwealth could be, about how this, in some sense, was a reparative move, to move from this era of extractive colonialism to one of extending the benefits of the motherland to all the Commonwealth citizens. And, so symbolically, this picture of the Empire Windrush sort of demonstrates that moment to me. But was it really like that? And what was the logic that attracted people to the NHS? Well, this man, Enoch Powell, of course, more famous for his Rivers of Blood speech, his xenophobic speech. In the same decade, the 1960s, that he made that speech, he was speaking in completely different terms about the NHS and about healthcare workers from the colonies, in particular India. He said to other ministers that there are a large number of doctors from overseas who come and add to our hospitals, trying to persuade his fellow ministers to understand the substantial reinforcement of the staffing to the hospitals in Britain. And in particular, when it came to discussing India, my own country of familial origin, he said, in discussion of the wealth of India, it is usual to forget the principal item, which is 400 millions of human beings, for the most part belonging to races neither unintelligent nor slothful. And so we see this duality, the same person who is xenophobic and doesn't want migrants to come as a rule, making an exception for skilled migrants for people who can benefit the economy. And so you might be surprised to know that Enoch Powell was, despite being anti-migration, attracting doctors in the 60s and 70s to come and work in the NHS. And one of the doctors who followed that call was my father. So he came in the 1970s, and the question I'm posed to you is, why did they come, and why did they stay? And we're going to hear more about that, I'm sure. But in terms of push factors, there is a post-colonial shadow left in places like India, where the infrastructure has been left in tatters, the governance is a mess, so much has been extracted from the colonies that any individual really would make a choice to at least train abroad. And most of the doctors who came did come just for that, to train and to return, 82%. But that's not how it went. And so just like my father, who also came to return to India, he never returned. And I think that's always been a lifelong struggle for him. He, like 2/3 of those who migrated, remained in the UK. Why was that? Why did his generation remain? Well, there's a lot of complex reasons for that, but I summarize it here by saying that they were, on the one hand, given jobs which had a higher proportion of service provision and arduous labor, and in terms of support that they needed to pass the exams, to get the promotions and qualifications that they came here to gain before returning home, they were denied the good support in that sense. And so, just like my father, many remained. And they remained in a environment which was hostile to them. And so throughout the 60s, 70s, and right to the present day, we see the media presentation of migrants in the NHS largely in negative terms. And so we have a cartoon here, you can see from the 60s, a disgusting cartoon, really, which implies that a lot of the migrants are incompetent and illiterate and unable to speak English. But that's not just a question of history. Even in more recent cases, this is a picture in the bottom left there of Dr. Bawa Garba. And for those of you who know, this is the case of Jack Adcock, who sadly died at the age of 6, and is obviously a tragedy, but there was a systems failure there involving the consultant, whose picture's there, and IT failures and so on, but it was her face and her name that got pegged to this case, and she became the scapegoat. And, what I argue is that for decades there has been this siege narrative complex, really, whereby there is, on the one hand, there is this creation essentially of a so-called color problem, which doesn't exist in reality, but has been created by the media. And so there's a generation, several generations of doctors who came and had to endure this kind of this racial discrimination. And one of those doctors, the same generation as my professor, and he's Ismail, who works in Manchester. One of the many things he's done in his career was to send out identical CVs and job applications in the early 90s to various hospitals and posts. And what he found was that if he kept the same application form and just changed the name from an English name to a name which was so-called foreign sounding, the candidate immediately became half as likely to be shortlisted for interview. Shocking finding. And he's gone on in later lectures to say that in particular, Asian doctors ended up working in the so-called Cinderella services of the NHS, becoming the indentured laborers of the NHS. And if you think that's strong, this is a quote from Lord Taylor of Harlow, who actually, in the House of Lords, said the very same thing. He said that overseas doctors are here to provide pairs of hands in the rottenest, worst hospitals in the country, because there is nobody else to do it. So Professor Ismail was not exaggerating. This was actually part of the plan. And so we see, sort of winding the clock forward, we see the legacy of that in enduring institutional racism. Even today, Black and Asian minority ethnic doctors are far more likely to be brought in front of misconduct committees for things that they have not done, or they're more likely to be hauled up. And there's a complex reason for that, but obviously I argue that is not representative of their behavior, that's a feature of institutional racism. On the other hand, white doctors are 3 times more likely to receive excellence awards, which come with financial benefits. And so people analyzing this kind of statistic have described the NHS, and this links to our theme of leadership here, as having snowy white peaks. And what do they mean by that? They mean that, whereas the large mountain of people who serve the NHS, a large proportion of that are people of color. But right at the top, in terms of chief executives, management, people with the highest pay packets and power, it's consistently older white men. And that was a historic fact in the decades that my father first came to this country. But sadly, even in my generation, as a doctor born and brought up in the UK, that is still a fact. And in fact, that's actually getting worse in recent years, with BAME doctors and managers comprising only 4% of management positions still. And here on the top right, you see what Asian and other doctors of color are doing in the NHS. And essentially what they're doing is the donkey work. You see here, I've highlighted associate specialists and specialty doctors. My father is a so-called associate specialist. And so you see here this purple graph, purple bar, correlating to Asian doctors. You see the overrepresentation in these 2 types of role. These are non-training posts with relatively low status, no progression, etc. And if you compare that to the average English population or even NHS staff, you see how much more represented those roles are compared to, say, consultants or even their juniors. And so we have a whole generation of people who are highly trained, highly skilled, having to endure for decades the kind of institutional racism that kept them out of the top positions, just to force them to train up younger doctors who went on to overtake them on the career ladder. It's a very painful thing that I think we rarely speak about in the NHS, and I think it needs to be confronted. I won't say much about this, but in my own age, I see the sort of legacy of that view that I mentioned earlier, the sort of duplicity of, on the one hand, wanting people to come to the NHS as long as it's good for the British economy, but keeping migrants away violently. And the recent hostile environment is obviously a great example of that. And horrifying that we're still having to debate this when you think that Aneurin Bevan in 1952 was saying that this whole kind of debate is just so nasty. Why can we not extend this socialized medicine and the civilized principle that the NHS embodies to all people, that it's false economy to enact this kind of hostile environment? That we can say more about that, I'm sure. So that's kind of really all I want to say. The NHS is very diverse. We should celebrate that, but I do think we don't say enough about this history. My family is just one case of thousands of families who have similar stories and links to colony and exploitation and institutional racism. And it's a complicated thing, and we have people on both black and white who have given very good analysis of this kind of problem. We have Gary Young writing in The Guardian saying, whatever sense of racial or national superiority one may harbour, it is likely to be tempered when the black foreigner in the white coat is the one charged with keeping you alive. And we have David Widgery, an East End GP, saying something which I think really this was written decades ago, but in this age of Brexit nationalism, really rings true for me, which is racism is as British as Biggles and baked beans. Racism is about Jubilee mugs and Rule Britannia and how we won the war. It would be pathetic if it hadn't killed and injured and brutalized so many lives, and if it wasn't starting all over again. So I hope that relating that story gives us some food for thought in the remaining talk. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Neil. That was really thought-provoking, and I I could really see how much like your history meant to you, and how that actually relates to like all of us in this room. Touching on the last point that you made, I just want to open the floor. The first question: has there been enough emphasis placed on celebrating and recognizing the contributions of South Asian healthcare professionals? Geeta, I understand that you wanted to talk first about this.
Thanks very much, Keith. Yeah, I just wanted to say, great presentation, Neil, and it really brings out quite a lot of the issues that are going on even today, like you mentioned. I don't think that there is enough going on to celebrate what the South Asians have brought into this country. It's interesting that we celebrated South Asian Heritage Month a couple of months ago, actually. And that was the time that they decided to celebrate it. So I remember various organizations did that celebration in different ways. But it's more about the fact that we shouldn't be just celebrating that South Asian Heritage Month for just that month and then forget all about it. I think this is history, and we need to celebrate it every day in different ways, and in trying to bring in that change that, Neil, you were talking about in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I also noted that, Julian Simpson, you have looked at the history of the NHS a lot in your time of writing. I was wondering if you had any more to say or anything to add in terms of how we've celebrated Southeast Asians and like contributions that BEN communities have made in the NHS.
Yeah, I thought it was an excellent presentation. I agree with everything that Neil said, really. I'd just like to double down on the imperial comparison. I don't think it's a stretch at all. I think in many ways, the NHS, certainly in its early decades, is a continuation of empire. And I think it's absolutely crucial to recognize that if you want to understand what goes on, certainly in the period that I looked at, and everything I've heard from people, although I haven't researched that, suggests that we're witnessing a continuation of very similar patterns. So in my book, for instance, I observed that if you'd mentioned the snowy white peaks of the NHS, in actual fact, if you look at how the NHS is structured, it's a replication of imperial structures. So you have white people at the top, you have Asian doctors, you have African Caribbean nurses, you have Africans who are more marginalized in the system. And for me, it's so obvious, but unfortunately, there's very little recognition of this. So to answer the question about whether this history is celebrated enough and discussed enough, I think the short answer is no. The longer answer is that maybe we actually need to think about how we talk about this history and some of the words that we use, because I think, again, to go back to the really excellent initial presentation, there's a lot in this history that really isn't to be celebrated. It is a continuation of empire. It is quite systematic professional discrimination and racism. So on one hand, you have to question whether this is something to be celebrated. I think we need to recognize it and we need to talk about it, but it is a very problematic history. And I think the other aspect of that is that, well, maybe you don't celebrate it. And I think maybe we question whether it's really appropriate to call it a contribution, because it's in actual fact much more than that. In a way, talking about the South Asian contribution or the contribution of migrants minimizes what they were doing. Because if you go back to fundamentally what the NHS is about, it's about providing healthcare for the most vulnerable sections of society, people who wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford it. And if you look at how the NHS has worked historically, you look at who has provided the care for people in inner cities, working class people, who's cared for people with mental illness, who's cared for the elderly, etc. And Asian doctors and other migrant doctors have been disproportionately represented in these areas. So fundamentally, migrants, and in particular South Asian migrants, have delivered the core mission of the NHS. So again, it's about saying that fundamentally, you don't have an NHS in its present form without the history of empire, without racism, without discrimination. It's important to have a conversation about that. I think talking about celebrating this history is actually quite problematic for me.
Thank you so much for that, Julian. I would like to hear from two other speakers. Ratnu, and then Rajan. Two very different ends of the spectrum. Ratnu just about to go into medicine, and Rajan just left medicine and retired. So it'd be very interesting to see the two different perspectives as well. So Ratnu, I'll give it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's once again, it's an absolutely excellent presentation from Neil. Just sort of change the dynamic of the conversation a little bit. It's important to recognise what are these achievements that BAME and particularly South Asian doctors have contributed to healthcare in general. So if we look at it in terms of different spheres, in terms of education, one of the first books we'll ever read as a medical student is Kumar and Clark. And the first name of that is Kumar, which already is a South Asian name. In leadership, we have people like Chan Nagpal of the BMA. So clearly people from South Asian backgrounds in very, very high positions in terms of leadership. In terms of research, there's huge numbers of South Asians involved in research and even literature. For example, Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, on the recommended reading lists for many doctors. So my point is that essentially there are people from South Asian backgrounds who are doing these phenomenal things day in, day out, who are excelling in their fields, who are doing an absolutely amazing thing. But to be celebrated doesn't necessarily have to just come from the exceptional things you do. As Julian was saying earlier, being celebrated is not just about having your name on publications. It's not just about having your name at the top of an organization. It's about the work you do day in, day out to improve the lives of vulnerable people. And that, I think, is one of the best contributions that South Asians have made. As we were saying earlier, about particularly in terms of people with mental illness, looking after them, people from the most vulnerable backgrounds of society. And that's where we can see the real impacts of BAME and South Asian doctors, nurses and pharmacists day in, day out. So I think we should look at it in terms of what we can do on a day-to-day basis, as well as the sort of high-level things as well.
Thank you so much for that. That was, I like that, the unsung heroes almost, the day-to-day people that you don't always recognize. I think that's really important. And I'd like to move on to Rajan finally to see if he has any more insights into this.
Well, firstly, Neil, thank you for your presentation. I don't know whether you've seen this book actually. Can you see it? It's called Medicine and the Raj.
No, I haven't. It looks really interesting. Yeah.
I've also sent you guys a link to the last article I'd written in the HSJ, which was about race and BME, treatment of BME staff in the NHS. And I mean, some of the stuff that Neil is talking about is very familiar to me. I lived through most of that anyway. I came here 40 years ago and I used to rage like everyone else, So I spent a lot of time when I was at Papio, chairing Papio, or on the GMC board, talking about these issues. And so whatever Neil has said, I understand. But I also, in the last few years since I retired and gave up some of that stuff, in fact, even the terminology caught me out. I hadn't realized that the word had moved on from BME to BAME suddenly. When I was around, we used to call it BME, and then suddenly it became BAME. So that caught me out. But leaving that aside, my own views have changed somewhat. And I'm was very interested in what Ratnu had to say. Let me explain what has happened here. Yeah? Before I go any further, there was one other thing I wanted to share with you. And Julian, nice to see you again. This is a book that Julian's colleague had published for me, Stephanie Snow, which was from Manchester, which was against the All Black and Minority Ethnic Clinicians in Manchester area. I tell you my latest experience. So Geeta talked about the South Asian Heritage Month, which was last month, wasn't it, Geeta? And I was asked to participate in a panel to celebrate South Asian Heritage Month. And it completely caught me out, simply because until I was asked to join that panel, I had no idea about South Asian Heritage Month. This just shows how out of touch I am to some extent. So I had to look it up. And even after the session, I could not get my head around it, because South Asian, as was defined, is group of 8 countries in South Asia region. And I was left puzzled as to what is in common between all of them. I'm from India, like many of the people on this call. And India and Pakistan, if you take the 2 largest countries in South Asia, they're at odds with each other. They're at each other's throats, for example. How come we were together? I didn't get it. So I began to think about it, and and Julia knows this better than I do. The history of immigrants from international, BIDA, IMA, and all that, to more recently PAPIO, and then various nationality organizations. And you already, in your introduction, Petra, you talked about celebrating the contribution of Afro-Caribbeans, for example. And of course, Neil has also referred to in his talk, and Geet, you also mentioned it, more and more polarization of society. And I began to wonder whether maybe the narrative need to change completely, which is partly where I was very interested in what Ratnu had to say, which is that why don't we actually acknowledge what has already been achieved? Yeah. And Ratnu gave the example of Chand, for example. And in fact, in medical establishment, apart from few areas, which is the Royal College of Surgeons, Physicians, and the GMC, most of the colleges have had an Asian president. People have broken through it. That is not to say it is easy. I mean, you have to fight through the system and again. But why don't we actually review where we are now and revisit the narrative? Because the danger is that we can continue to bring forward the same old issues and we continue to seek the same solutions. Because some of those people who have broken through the system is not because of anything else, but the fact they've learned to work the system now. That's what we are doing. The system has not changed. It's just that some people have found a way to break through that system. BMA elections are won or lost on 9% of voting, for example. Yeah. So it's not actually as if everybody's contributing to it. You learn to manage the system. So to finish off my long ramble, I think I'm particularly interested in creating a new narrative about this whole issue around race. Because it's not just race. Society is so polarized, it's unbelievable. We all know what is happening with far right and all the other stuff. Yeah. And if you bring other characteristic, whether it's disability or gender, we'll all be talking about the same thing. Yeah. Everybody's trying to demonstrate how unequal they are, how discriminated they are. So I think we should review the situation. We should learn from the past. Let's not keep doing the same old thing again. How about celebrating and acknowledging, etc.? Let's rephrase it. And the answer ultimately is not through creating more and more divisions. You will never, ever get to that place if we continue to divide ourselves. I think we need to come out of it. And I think I'll be interested more in what you have to say, Geet, about the initiative that you started on respect and dignity. I think you mentioned you're doing something on respect, is to actually start developing those common values as human beings. Let's bring forward some of those human values, which is the way we'll create the level playing field. We will not create the level playing field by continuing to talk about divisions. So, sorry, a long ramble. I should stop there with this initial contribution, and I'm interested to hear more from others.
No, please do not apologize. That was really insightful and really engaging. So thank you for that. Yeah, the Respect Empowers campaign was certainly about making those cultural changes and making sure everyone celebrates each other, celebrates what they're doing. And it's mainly for the unsung heroes. So not just for doctors, but also other healthcare professionals that we don't normally talk about, or working in the healthcare, such as porters, such as the support staff that we couldn't do our job without. And I know we touched on a lot about how we need to celebrate what we've done, but what are the things that we can do? How can we move forward from this? What are the changes that need to be made in order to recognize the influences these groups have made towards the NHS? and move further on? Is it something that we need to change within ourselves and stop viewing ourselves as different and try and integrate ourselves? Or is it something that there needs to be structural changes as well? I would like Neil to start, if he doesn't mind, to share his opinion on this, if that's okay.
I think it needs to be debated with you know, I don't think any individual is going to come up with that. I mean, as was already mentioned, you know, I think the least we could do is to not speak negatively consistently in the media, you know. So before we even get to sort of positive representations and statues in London and whatever else we think we might need, which might be good ways of memorializing the contributions of doctors here. You know, I live in Brighton, and just about a mile from my house, there is a monument to the Indian soldiers who contributed to the First World War. You know, until I moved here and I heard about that, I had no idea that there was a huge number of people from the colonies, including India, losing their lives and contributing to the war effort. Is that ever discussed when we read, you know, war poetry and discuss the Great War, the so-called Great War? You know, so I think the least we can do is to not talk about migrants and migrants in the disgusting ways that I've already discussed, and then we can begin to think about positive portrayals, whether that's you know, in fiction, in the news, or in sort of memorials that I've already just described.
Yes, I agree. I think changing language is the first and foremost thing that you need to do. It's something that's inherent, and then it reflects on what we truly think. I understand Geeta has like a important opinion about this. So I'd like her to share her views, if that's okay.
So this is about how do we make the changes? How do we make people be seen out there who are doing all this amazing work in the South Asian world or in the BAME community? I think firstly we need to understand that, you know, there's a bit of an imposter syndrome also in all these people. So it's trying to bring them out and try to make sure that they come, they are bringing their whole self to work and come and celebrate about what they're doing. We need to help create that atmosphere. And I always say that with my teams, that unless and until they have that safe cultural and psychological safe space that they can bring all this to, this is not going to happen. Because, you know, for them to come and actually say, you know what, this is what has happened, or this is what, I mean, even now at this stage in life, I find it difficult. Like, you know, I remember going into a committee meeting where I was the only female in that committee of white males. And every time I tried to say something or give an idea, I would get talked over. And if I said something, then somebody else would take that idea and then say it in a different way, and then everybody would applaud. And this is like, you know, not very many years ago. And this is despite being in leadership positions. So I think it's that kind of culture that you create so that people then come out and say, you know what, I have done this. I'm really good enough for it, and get out of that space. And that needs some work doing. And that is actually, you know, they say we keep talking about diversity, we keep talking about inclusion, that it's the belonging that matters. Okay. And I often, because I love dancing, I often bring this example up where, you know, diversity is being asked to the party, invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance at the party. But you know what belonging is? It is dancing without worrying about what other people think about you. So that's where we need to hit. That is that sweet spot which we hit, and then we bring all these people in with us to celebrate.
Yeah, that's a very nice analogy, being asked to dance at parties when you certainly feel included, and certainly when I feel included. So thank you for that. I think it's really important what you're saying, and also the role models that we have to look up to, because I feel like once you see people who do it, you feel like you can't be stopped. I'd like to invite Ratnu, because I imagine he's in a similar position I was in a few years ago, looking up to people. And seeing that change. So I'd like you to share your opinions, if you don't mind, Ratner.
Yeah, so it was really, really interesting to hear what you particularly had to say, Neil, about language and how we actually frame the narrative around that. And also, I absolutely love the dancing analogy, but unfortunately, I don't get invited to dance at many parties, let alone anything else. So I think if we think about the changes that need to be made in order to recognise the influences that groups have made towards the NHS, change comes from lots of different ways. Change comes from within. Change comes from the kind of structural way in which things happen. And it's also important to recognise what we can do and the limits of what we can do within our spheres. So in terms of changing the language, but what we can do is we can present positive actions. We can present, the impacts that BAME, South Asian people are having within healthcare. So I would argue that it's more impactful for someone who is, say, I don't know, if they're a racist, to be treated by a BAME doctor, to have good quality care. And that is the power that we have. That's the power in our hands. We don't necessarily have, that the influence to change what the press does, but we have the influence to change our own actions and influence people around us that way. And so in order to kind of recognize those influences, we make the influence ourselves. That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Well, two things. Firstly, I have a question and then some comment. The question is relating to your question about what changes need to be made. I am out of touch, but the last time I was looking at this issue, we were starting something called WRES, Workforce Race Equality Standards. I was actually on the steering group when it was set up, and then I resigned after the initial meetings. What happened with WRES? Wasn't that the ultimate structural change that was being introduced to bring equality? Does anybody have any information on what is happening with WRES? Isn't that working now? Hasn't it actually made the difference that was planned?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Rajan, that the race equality standards have been designed. They have actually been, they're trying to implement that, and it's, setting out targets for each of the organizations to meet. And they came out with their report in 2019, which does not make great reading because things haven't changed dramatically, and there needs to be a lot more happening.
Right. So that is going to be my comment because you have just confirmed it. I didn't know about it. Sorry, Geeta. I've not been following it. But you just confirmed it. And what you've confirmed to me is that doing the same things and expecting different results is not the way forward. That way lies madness. Yeah. We have to do something different. Yeah. And I'll be, and if I may be provocative slightly, Neil, if I were to ask you to suspend your ancestral history, forget what happened to your grandfather and your parents, yeah? Talk about yourself, yeah? Yeah, what exactly was your experience? And similarly, I was interested in what Geet had to say at the start of it, which is, Geet, if I remember correctly, you said you came in 1995, if I remember, you said you did not face anything. Because the point I'm trying to get to is that there's a danger of actually perpetuating some of those old myths. Not myths, sorry, myths is the wrong word. They were lived experiences, those people. And I'm one of those people. I faced all of that stuff, yeah? But I would like us to, going back to changing the narrative and using different language, I'd like to understand more about if you were to, let go of the past, what would it be like? What does it mean to be a BME person in the NHS now, whether as a student, Ratnu is, or junior doctor like Geet, or yourself, Neil, who's established GP. Of course, I know about Geeta. So how does it feel? And whilst you're thinking about it, let me give you one other example, which may seem quite pedantic, or I don't know what the right word is, but let me give you this example which came up at the South Asian Heritage Month meeting that I referred to earlier on. And people are getting really upset about the fact that when they were in school or in the neighborhoods, they were called different names. So some local people find it very difficult to pronounce some of the South Asian names. So very often either they'll truncate them or give them a different name. Yeah. And whilst I could understand that because it's part of respect, I found it actually intriguing because I have never taken offense. Yeah. When people have shortened my name, I'm often called Raj rather than Rajan. And when I first came to this country and I started applying for jobs, I used to collect the way people used to write my surname. My surname is Madho. Most people can't say it actually. If you're not South Asian, you can't actually say it. Julian, I won't test you. But the fact of the matter was that people would write it differently. And I used to collect it. It ranged from mad dog to mad hog to haddock and all that. And I said, okay, chill, man. So why were people becoming, and I began to wonder whether we're really trying to find a reason to get angry or stay angry. Let's get over certain things. But with that, final comment, very interested to know what is the current experience. How does it feel to be a person of BME origin and maybe born in this country, but currently in the NHS?
Thank you so much for that. I remember when my uncle actually asked me, I was in Canada at the time, and he was asking me, do you feel the racism, or do you feel any sort of racism in the UK? And I told him it really depends on how you see yourself. For me, I've always seen myself as belonging here, and I always see myself as part of the NHS and working for the NHS. So I feel like, I think it was touched on before, that whole idea of imposter syndrome, where if you feel like you belong, then you apply for more leadership opportunities, you feel like you will get them. And I think that's how, like, we as young professionals, especially those who are just coming in, need to move forward, and we need to recognize what's happened, but we also need to move forward as well. We can't stay hung up on it. So I think the next question actually touches on how can we push for greater influence from South Asian professionals to be in more leadership roles. Geeta, I think you wanted to touch briefly on this, so I'll open the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks, Geet. I think I like the idea of positivity that Rajan was talking about. So I can tell you my story. I came into this country in 1995, and I was a practicing vitreoretinal consultant in India before I came. I came here because my brother was here and I wanted to take my fellowship exams. So that was the reason I came. But like Neil said, so then things changed and we then decided to stay back. And I started as an SHO, so from consultant to SHO, then was doing a registrar job when I got two opportunities, one to do a fellowship, a vitreoretinal fellowship in Liverpool. We used to live in Luton at that time. My husband's a radiologist and he was working in London. And I felt that, it was too much to try and split the whole family. And my son needed a bit more of stability. So a staff grade job, in those days it was called a staff grade job, an SAS job came up in Frimley, and I decided to go for that job. I still remember my brother not talking to me for a whole week, thinking I had just ruined my career because of that. But you know what? At that point in time in my life, it was the right decision. I then had absolutely supportive consultants. So this is where, we talk about how we get these people into leadership roles. So they basically said to me, come on, you need to apply through this Article 14, that was what it was called, or the Caesar route, and then go on to the specialist register. And then I became a consultant. So I took a circuitous route to become a consultant. I, could have stayed in that space of the SAS doctor, and I think I would have still been happy. But that's my personality. But the important thing there was that there were people there. So, we talk about coaching, mentoring, but there's a thing called sponsorship, okay? So when we talk about coaching, a coach talks to you, a mentor talks with you. But when you're talking about sponsorship, a sponsor is somebody who talks about you when you're not there to give you that push up on that ladder. That is what we need. If we need to actually get all our colleagues up that leadership ladder or whatever area that they want to go into, we need to have lots more sponsors. We need to actually send that ladder down once you're up in that leadership position so that they can come up. You need to give them opportunities to actually, there needs to be a cultural transformation. You need to give them opportunities to go and do a lot more leadership courses. There are lots of leadership courses now in the Leadership.Academy, etc., where you're giving them the skills to then go and do that role. What shouldn't happen is, because RES has come out saying that the board now needs X number of percentage of people on the BAME, of BAME community, that we actually tick the box by bringing people in who actually don't have the skills to then manage that kind of a role. We need to give them the skills, develop them, and then take them into those leadership positions. And like you were saying, role modeling help, because, if you go into a committee where you don't see anybody like yourself in that committee, that doesn't give you very much confidence in when you're going in there for the first time. So you need to create that cultural transformation. And unfortunately, that does take time. But I think that's what we need to do. I think we have focused too much on the data and the problems and the issues, as well as what were the causes. We need to now move into that solution space and try and find ways in which we can, and you young people are the people who should be actually taking this forward, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was a lot of things to touch on there, the positivity, the role models, and not being disheartened and moving forward with positivity. I'd like to bring in Julian, if that's all right with him, because I know he's read a lot about the history of the NHS. I was wondering, anything we can learn from our history to move forward, or anything?
I think so, absolutely. That's why I started researching the history of migration, because I feel that talking about the way migrants have shaped British society is one of the ways in which we can shift discourses. And I think it's absolutely vital that we talk about migrants and work, rather than talk about culture, the ways in which people are different. This old question of, why did you leave? And I really think we need to turn that on its head and say, well, why did you stay? It's very boring, really. Why not leave? Why not go and do something? And focus on the specific roles that people have played. And I think, going back to what was said before, if we reflect on the specific nature of the roles of South Asian migrant doctors, for instance, which is the group that I studied, you realise that this institution that is seen as very central to British identity is in fact the product of the labour of migrants and is the product of the imperial legacies. So I think that's absolutely essential. If we start to recognise that, then we maybe start creating a space for a different type of discourse. I also think, as an outsider, if I can maybe challenge the culture of medicine, I think if we can start shifting what is valued in medicine, then we maybe also start to gain a bit of recognition for this work and different perceptions of what people have done. And I think this is about professional cultures generally. Doctors tend to aspire to do certain types of work, generally work involving young people, rapid interventions with dramatic results. What you don't aspire to generally as a medical student is to go to work, say, as a geriatrician. I think there needs to be maybe a reflection as to why certain types of work are not valued in the way that they should be. In other words, it would be a good idea to try and align the culture of medical schools with the needs of patients. And in actual fact, again, this is a way of realizing how central migration is to the history of the NHS, because, and I think this is again why it's important to talk not in terms of contribution, but in terms of the absolutely vital role of migrant healthcare practitioners. Because in a way, if people were doing these jobs, it's not because there was a shortage of doctors at the time. This is a fallacy. And we still have a medical policy in this country which aims to somehow, from somewhere, generate medical self-sufficiency. This is a myth, because what you get is you train people in British medical schools. They're essentially on an international market. They can go and work anywhere. So essentially, if, work in inner city general practice, work in psychiatry, work in geriatrics, other types of work, emergency medicine are not valued, these people are going to migrate. And then you have people migrating from elsewhere to take their roles. And I think you need to really understand the culture of medicine as an international culture, and one where people move around the world, and there's a flight from certain types of medical care. So again, if we can try and challenge that, I think that would be really valuable. And the final thing I'll say that we can learn from the history is one of the things that I found quite striking from looking at the archival material in the 1970s and also interviewing some of the people who were very active politically at the time in what was then the Overseas Doctors Association, the predecessor of what's now the British International Doctors Association, was in the 1970s, the political structures representing Asian doctors at the time were quite fragmented, and the ODA brought that together. And very quickly, so you had Indian doctors, Pakistani doctors, doctors from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, further down the line, working together and applying a lot of pressure to the medical establishment. If you look at the archival material at the time in the British Medical Association, it's quite striking. This really shakes up the medical establishment, and people feel they have to pay attention to what these doctors have to say. And from speaking to some of the leaders at the time, I really got the sense that, you know, this sense that you were working together, you represented 10,000 doctors, gave you quite a lot of power. So I think maybe a reflection on how fragmented organizations have become since then, how they might come together and work together, I think would be also very useful in terms of taking this agenda forward.
Okay, great. Thank you for that insight there. I believe Ratnu wanted to come in next and share his opinion, so I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, if we think about the question, how can we push for greater influence from South Asian professionals to be in more leadership roles? Why? Why should we be asking this question in the first place? Why should it be a South Asian question as opposed to a merit question? Do we want people to be in leadership roles because they're South Asian? Or do we want them to be in leadership roles because they have the talent, they have the commitment, and they have the vision to enact change within the healthcare system? So I'd argue that the question itself can be seen as a bit of a null point. But sort of going on from that, why is it then that people from South Asian and BAME backgrounds aren't represented? That's the real question we should be asking. So is it because they don't feel like they're competent enough? Is it because there is racism that exists within the NHS? Or is it because of personal limitations that, you know, people don't feel like they have the ability, they have the imposter syndrome? So I think that ultimately, it's not about where you're from, it's not about your background, it's about the ideas you have, it's about diversity of thought as much as diversity of colour. And so ultimately, it's about, you know, how can we make sure that the best person is right for the job as opposed to just a question of background?
Okay, great. Before we move on to the next question, the final question, I'll invite Neil if he'd like to share his thoughts and opinions on this.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting to hear everyone's perspective on this. You know, I think partly, you know, we're talking about positivity and negativity and focusing on the future and the past and so on. And some of this, I'm sure, boils down to your own personality, your own, you know, taste in that regard. You know, some people are just more likely to do one or the other. But and maybe I am a less positive person than many of you on the panel. I'm sure that's true. However, I think there's a few things I want to say in response to that. One is, I think that to be upset about this and to sort of remind people of the history isn't necessarily a reflection of proximity. In fact, I think my parents and grandparents would probably be less likely to talk about colonial histories and institutional racism. In fact, we have never really, in technical words, used those terms. And they have always said what other people on this panel have just said, which is work twice as hard and get on, and, you know, you can make it, you know, despite all the truth that I've just presented. So it's not my proximity that makes me more negative. If anything, I think it might be the distance that allows me to see things and have the privilege and power that my parents didn't have to actually be able to critique the system that they're in and that we're all in. And secondly, I want to say that there's asking people to sort of not smile through it. I think it's great. You know, we should all be positive and engaged at work, and we shouldn't, you know, allow our own misfortunes to bring us down and to make us bad at our jobs. However, when misfortunes are systematic, it's different. You know, it's different to you know, not getting a job just because, and not getting a job along with thousands of other people over decades, as the statistics show, because of the color of your skin. And so what I would argue is, you know, fine. I think sorry to bring in the pandemic, but I think what the COVID situation shows, and the mortality disparities in between white and BAME groups, demonstrate this, I think, really acutely. And so you could ask a BAME key worker working in a shop and retail and the NHS, you could say, don't complain about the situation and the fact that systematically you're more likely to have a job which puts you at risk. Smile at work, be positive, put your whole heart into it, and everything's going to be okay. You'll rise to the top of the career ladder. Not wanting to weaponize people dying right now, but that isn't going to stop people dying. That is not going to change the systematic death disparity between BAME and white groups. And so what I would say is it's one thing to ask people to sort of to do something individually about it, which I'm sure has some contribution, but I do think we must not forget to hold the institution accountable, to think about broader narratives. Of course, it's more difficult to unpick those things as individuals and as a medical profession. It's much harder to get the whole country to talk about the complicated racial history of the NHS. However, I think in the long term, we are bound to be running up that hill, if you like, in terms of correcting wage gaps and death disparities, unless we do more to confront that in an honest and critical, but also positive way.
No, I really agree with that. I think also the positivity is definitely something we need to move forward. But what you're talking about is the structural changes that need to be there. And I think it's enlightening to see your perspective and actually maybe taking a step back and actually saying how can the structure be changed to mutually benefit everyone. Because at the end of the day, if there are so many people who are, the NHS is so diverse, you need leadership to represent that diversity, to make the most and create decisions that benefit everyone. So then that poses my next question, which is, how can we create an environment where individuals are empowered by their cultural heritage and do not perceive their cultural differences to be a barrier in the way they relate to other healthcare professionals? I would go to Geeta, if that's okay, to share her views.
Now, that is a uphill task, I would say, in making sure that you're creating that environment where all those individuals are not worried about their cultural heritage and able to move through those barriers. Because being female and being a BAME person has always been a double whammy, so it's not easy. But what I would say is that, I remember one of my colleagues at work who's from Bangladesh said that he wants to bring his whole self to work. He needs to be actually safe to bring his whole self to work, to be authentic. So it is about trying to move forward in that area where you're not leaving all your culture behind. And one of the things that he was discussing was the fact that, when he was born in this country, but he had this complete dissociation between what his culture was and who he was. And he was trying to, merge the two. And it was quite a difficult situation. And that's when I just thought back and I said, yes, I think that it's important that we keep our culture and still need to move forward. And that is quite, it is difficult. It is going to be difficult. I have never changed my accent after coming into this country. I still sometimes wear saris to work. And I remember him telling me that he used to not let his mum come into school with him because she used to wear a sari, because he used to feel, this was his kind of culture. He wanted to move away from it. So, it's the similar situation that we have to go through when you're trying to actually move forward with your culture, with everything around you, with your failures. You can't often your failures either in your life, and move forward. And it is actually seeing other people do that sometimes helps the situation. Seeing that somebody who's ahead of you has actually, gone through all of this and has got there in the end, And despite everything, despite all the, sometimes it's like going through treacle, you're trying to go up there in that direction, and you're getting pulled back about 10 steps back, and then you have to start your journey again. And it's trying to actually make sure that when you've done it, making sure that you actually empower all those people. I would use the word, enable all those other people around you to do it. So one of the things that I did, because I had taken the circuitous route, I now know, I know how I can support all those international medical graduates who come in, who are in that middle grade job, to actually go and do the Caesar route and get consultant jobs if that is what they want to do, and giving them those skills to do it. So it's just creating that kind of an atmosphere around people, making sure that you're actually helping them, valuing them, if you value people, you find that other people start doing the same. And it's actually making sure that kind of an psychological safe space there, I call it, for all your teams. It's also about telling them about your weaknesses. That's really an interesting conversation. Now, for me, when I meet or work with different teams, so one of the things I do is actually talk to them about myself. Now, I'm a control freak, an absolute control freak. So I tell them that. I said, I'm a control freak. And if I am actually sitting with you and having a discussion, and you find that I'm actually going into that space, just pull me back and tell me, stop, that's not where we need to go. So, it's telling them about yourself, making sure that you're actually bringing your whole self into work so that they actually can do the same, actually has helped a lot, I feel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's certainly something I resonate with as well. I think not during university, but before that, when I was at school, during that period where I was just came from Sri Lanka, I was going into medicine, I was having that identity struggle with, am I Sri Lankan, am I British? I almost felt like I had to choose between the two. At the end, what I realized was I'm an amalgamation of the two, and I associate with some things of my Sri Lankan culture. I always respect it, always go back to Sri Lanka every other year to see family. But also there are, to be honest, now there's more stuff I associate with the British culture. So I think everyone has a personal journey with that. And I think having role models such as yourself and a lot of people on this panel is really important to have those discussions with. Something I had to, luckily my parents were there as well, who are doctors in the UK, to have a discussion with and have those role models there. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's something that's really important. I would just maybe, Ratnu, maybe yourself, could you share any light on your experiences or how we can celebrate our culture as well?
Yeah, I would absolutely echo everything that you just said right now. There is no one or the other. We're not just Indian, we're not just Sri Lankan, and we're not just British. We are a product of both our genes, our environment, our culture. Everything around us makes us who we are. But at the same time, if we think about, how can we create an environment where individuals are empowered by their cultural heritage? There's that aspect of pride. There's an aspect of pride of being proud of who you are, where you come from, your heritage. And instead of viewing it as something negative, sorry to use the word, view it as something positive. Having people from different backgrounds can, fully empower an organization, empower a team. I know that many of my friends are very happy when I bring jalebis in or gulab jamun. And it's these small things like that make people think that, it's not just viewing people of South Asian background negatively, but the positive things that people of those backgrounds can bring. So I think that pride in who you are and where you come from is an integral part of ensuring that people are empowered by their culture. And another thing to bear in mind is that there's more that unites us than divides us when it comes to healthcare. Everyone on this panel, everyone working in the NHS in general, is united by a common desire to improve the health of the people around the world, and it's to provide good quality care. And so focusing on that as a core tenet, and then everything else around that as additions to who we are and what we do is fundamental.
Thank you for that. That's really, really nicely said. Could we bring in Neil Singh?
Yeah, empowerment by cultural heritage. I agree with lots of what's been said. I think there's been great comments already. The only thing I would add, perhaps, is we can't just rely on our own personal experience and And what I mean by that is we need more than just stories from around us. We need an analysis. It's not enough just to sort of know that Indian doctors came here, both for South Asians and for British people, by the way. We need an analysis like what I tried to summarize in the presentation of why that happened, and there's lots of other ways of looking at it. Like Geeta rightly said, there's an intersection, let's say, of race and gender. And we need an analysis of how that plays out by listening to people like Geeta. We need I guess knowing technical words, social theory may be a bit too far, but being able to talk about your experience in ways which are beyond just pained or blindly positive, in ways that sort of acknowledge the complexity of that, as lots of other people have just sort of said, I think is a beginning. And to sort of accept, just in the same way that misogyny is not a female problem, the kind of stuff that I was discussing is not just a problem for South Asians to deal with. We can't just scratch our heads and build up our muscles and try harder. This is a problem for the whole society, the whole of the NHS, whatever color people are from, and the whole country. So it's about everyone taking responsibility for this problem, not just the so-called victims or people who have systematically done less well. But absolutely, we need to hear more voices. I mentioned fiction just in passing earlier, but when was the last time we saw real complex narrative of South Asian history, or of a nurse of color? These people are often passing characters in television shows, and but we need to sort of add the full narrative and complexity, the struggle, the joy, all the stuff that you just mentioned. That needs to be shared in all its complexity, I feel, for us to be fully humanized, and then from then on, empowerment, I think, comes with that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Before we close off, as I'm just aware of the time, people need to get to their dinners. Would Julian or Rajan, would you like to add anything before we finish? I'll start off with Julian. He's ready to go.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think one thing we haven't mentioned, and I think that we really shouldn't underestimate, is the importance of the mainstream changing and becoming more receptive. And I think that's absolutely key, because ultimately it's good to empower people, it's good to make people more confident. If they're going to be hitting obstacles and coming up against glass ceilings, it doesn't really help them, and in a way it sets them up to fail. And certainly from looking at the history that I looked at, there's a lot of that happening. And I think sometimes it's important to reflect on exactly what we mean by racism, to the extent I ended up talking quite a lot about heterophobia, in a way, because that was a better way of understanding, in some instances, what people were describing to me. So a lot of people did say, oh, well, no, racism wasn't a problem for me. Then when you did a life story interview with them, you found things started to emerge. So you had someone who, for instance, was a very confident surgeon from Pakistan, sort of moving in these elevated circles. Then he described once being invited to this reception, and the sherry was flowing, and it's like, as a Muslim, he was thinking, what on earth do I do? And obviously he refused to drink, and suddenly there's a tension, and so people would come up against things like that. And one person said to me, oh, I never had a problem, it was fine. And then he described to me being a trainee in a hospital in the north of England, and say, oh, well, this is what happened. And actually I gained quite a lot of experience, because all of the British doctors went off to the pub to have a drink, and I was left in charge of the ward. So he saw that as really great, and being able to get experience. I perceived that as actually you're completely outside of a lot of networks. And for me, one of the really striking things when I started writing about this history was some of the resistance I found to the notion of migrants as architects of the NHS. And I did think there was something quite profoundly disturbing psychologically for a lot of white people in saying, this institution, which you think typifies Britishness, is in actual fact the product of migration and imperial legacies. And I do think one of the problems we have here, and one of the things that needs to be addressed if we're going to move on, is this notion of imperial legacy. And I do think we have a problem in the UK of contributions from elsewhere not being valued because they're pretty much per se defined as being inferior to anything that comes from Britain. So I'd be very interested to know if anyone in the history of the NHS has ever done any reflection as to what, for instance, British medicine can learn from medicine in India, in Zimbabwe, in Brazil. As far as I'm aware, that has never happened, or maybe it's happened in a very isolated setting that hasn't become generalized. Now, if people were empowered and were able to say, well, actually, this is how I worked when I trained as a doctor in Harare, and they were taken seriously, I think that would change the dynamic. And I think the UK has a lot to learn from how medicine is practiced in other parts of the world. But I think that still is quite a revolutionary idea, even in 2020, that British doctors might have something to learn from counterparts in the global south. So I think we need to not underestimate the extent to which there is strong resistance to any idea that anyone from outside of the white mainstream having something to contribute in this area. I really think that needs to not be underestimated.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julian, for that. Would Rajan, before we finish, would you like to say anything or a few words on the topic?
Firstly, thank you very much to you for arranging this session this evening. It is still an important topic. There is a long way to go. People refer to Roger's previous report, Snowy Peaks. At one stage, I used to talk about not just snowy peaks, I used to talk about permafrost. Yeah, snowy peaks you could still climb, but there's permafrost in some areas. And I referred to a few areas which are still no-go. GMC chair or Royal College of Physicians or surgeons are still no-go, although other colleges have seen successes. Yeah, so there's a long way still to go. And in getting there, I think there have been some observations already made, so I don't want to repeat much of what has already been said. But to me, there is a balance between celebration and in your face. So whilst we should be proud and celebrate our heritage, it's not about in your face stuff, because that creates the other and that brings the superiority thing. And I would like us to be cautious about the balance between those two. And ultimately, I think it also comes down to you as a person. So there is a responsibility on each of us, not because of race, but as a human being, to try and live to our potential, to have that confidence. And especially if one chooses to go into medicine, that should be something that should be encouraged from the very beginning, to have that self-confidence. But of course, I do recognize that it's not easy. You can be daunted. So the onus is on some of us, older people, to try and make them welcome and create that kind of environment. And the point was made about, dancing analogy and sponsorship, etc., to leave the ladder and not pull the ladder up after you, and give people some leg up. So I think it is important on both sides, on the younger side, to have that confidence and talk about you as a person, not just talk about race itself, but on the older folk, to try and help level the system up a bit more, to encourage merit rather than the race itself. And finally, if you allow me to show off slightly, I would like to make a distinction. I think Julian probably referred to it earlier. I think there is a distinction between race and migrants, if I understood Julian correctly. And I think to me, being migrant was more an issue rather than being Black or minority ethnic or an Asian. And I just wanted to finish off by showing off by reciting a poem that I wrote, if you allow me. I mean, I dabble in poetry, yeah? So this one is called The Immigrant. Leaving on that jet plane for the distant shores, dream come true, going to England, new start, new life, excited and daunted. Will I make it? Will it be worthwhile? Will I miss folk back home? Will they miss me? Fast forward 3 decades, neither Indian nor English, pulled by both, resentful of both. India of youth gone, England has changed too. Or is it me, unable to adapt, rootless and restless, the first generation immigrant? So I think there is something about the first generation immigrants, yeah, who may have more struggle than the second and subsequent generation. And I would like to perhaps leave that thought with you to think more about the difficulties faced by migrants rather than just because the color itself. Over.
So yeah, thank you so much for that, Rajan. A very beautiful quote to end on. Firstly, thank you for all the panelists, Julian, Geeta, Ratnu, Dr. Neil, and Rajan as well. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your opinions. I'd just like to briefly summarize it. So we had the presentation by Neil first, just to give us, enlighten us all and give a sense of the topic, giving us a history of our past and how our culture has affected the NHS thus far. We talked about the first question, has there been enough emphasis on celebrating and recognizing the contributions? We talked about the unsung heroes and needing to celebrate them. We talked about having conversations about history and about the ways to move forward as well. And developing those common values about the respect campaign that I did the year before, and to really emphasize each other's human beings. We then, the next question was what changes needed to be made in order to recognize the influence these groups have made towards the NHS. We talked about the change of language that needs to happen. That's such a foremost and such a fundamental important thing, just to not speak about the negativity about each other. And we also briefly touched about imposter syndrome and the need to create that aspect of culture and have a safe space where we can truly feel ourselves. The third question is how we can actually push forward for greater influence in the South Asian professions and to be included in more leadership roles. We talked about having that positive mindset, having those leadership roles, talking about mentoring and sponsorship as well, to really empower each other to get up on the next rung of the ladder. We talked about how alongside that, we also need structural changes to occur. There's as much good as can be done, having great positivity, but there needs to be structural that Neil kindly enlightened us to as well. So that was a really insightful point there. And lastly, we talked about actually celebrating our cultural differences. I think we heard from people very junior in the field coming in about having that almost dissociation and that identity crisis of where we one culture or another, and actually we're an amalgamation, we're all individuals, and we need to celebrate that and actually celebrate how the NHS was formed and using our history to move forward. So it's been a very interesting discussion. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you learned something from it, because I surely did. So once again, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for your time. And I wish you all the best in all your professions and leadership roles.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Rajan Menon, the Director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.